The events unfold in the 19th century. In the opening scenes, we see a tearful girl running away. After sunset, it started raining. The girl was soaked but continued walking. At some point, she saw light emanating from the windows of a house. Her strength quickly left her. When the girl reached the house, she couldn't even knock. The homeowner, St. John Rivers, noticed the girl and brought her inside. His sisters, Diana and Mary, were horrified when they saw the condition of their guest. The girl was warmed up. Judging by her dress and appearance, she was not a vagabond. John, Diana and Mary asked the guest for her name. The girl's name is Jane Eyre, but she couldn't even utter it aloud. Jane simply said she needed to hide. While in a fever, Jane recalls her distant past. She had been hiding from her cousin John Reed, who disliked her because she was much smarter. Jane always found secluded places to read books alone. But this time John found her and took the book away. Jane, who had a spirited temperament, was able to stand up for herself. Seeing a fight between her niece and son, Mrs. Reed became furious. Everyone in the house considers Jane to be insane. She is often locked in her room and left alone. Later, Robert Brocklehurst arrived at Mrs. Reed's request and spoke with Jane. When he asked about the girl's background, Mrs. Reed said that Jane's mother was her husband's sister. A few years ago, the girl became an orphan. Mrs. Reed promised to take care of her, but Jane was uncontrollable, so the woman wants to send her to an orphanage for girls. Mr. Brocklehurst believed Mrs. Reed's claim that Jane had a wicked heart and assured that she would be re-educated there. When Mr. Brocklehurst left, Jane told Mrs. Reed that she hated her more than anyone in the world. Many people think Mrs. Reed is kind, but it's just a mask. That same night, Jane was taken to an orphanage for girls. When the journey came to an end, Jane was escorted to the others. The institution had strict rules. The girls were forbidden to wear fancy dresses and do many other things. Jane befriended another girl named Jane Elliott. In the present, Jane woke up in one of the rooms at the Rivers house. Having recovered a bit, she joined John and his sisters for breakfast, introducing herself as Jane Elliott. Mary and Diana were delighted to have her company. Unlike John, Jane genuinely didn't want to cause them much trouble and asked for help in finding a job. John promised to help. Learning that the guest had been raised in an orphanage, he asked what they were taught there. Jane recalled the lessons at the orphanage. Any disobedience was severely punished. Mr. Brocklehurst was the head there, ensuring everyone followed the rules. For her disobedience, Jane was left without food and water for an entire day. Mr. Brocklehurst said it would help her understand how meager the life of a sinner is. Jane stood on the pedestal of shame until evening. A girl named Helen Burns secretly brought her a piece of bread. Since then, the girls became friends. Jane doesn't hide her hatred for the teachers, while Helen says that life is too short to waste on enmity. Helen's kindness instilled a ray of hope in Jane. In the present, Mary Rivers became interested in Jane's drawings. It turns out she's an amazing artist. Even perpetually gloomy John appreciated the guest's artistic talents, though in the drawing he appeared too severe. In the past, Helen suffered from fever. Despite the teacher's prohibitions, Jane stayed by her side all night. Despite everything, Helen was happy because she was returning to God. Helen asked Jane not to grieve for her. Shortly after these words, she passed away. Now Jane was once again completely alone. In the present, Mary and Diana left for the city. Meanwhile, John told Jane how he opened a school for boys in this parish a few years ago. Now it was time to open a school for girls, so a teacher was needed. The salary was modest, but Jane gladly accepted it. She would be happy to teach the peasant girls to read and write. Soon Jane moved to a village house on the outskirts, funded by benefactors. This was the first home where no one would dictate to her what to do. Jane sincerely thanked John for everything. When John left, Jane remembered how her time at the orphanage had ended. All those years had been a nightmare for Jane, but she found the strength to leave with dignity. After that, Jane arrived at the wealthy estate of Thornfield, where she was offered the position of governess. Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper, turned out to be a very kind and gentle woman. Escorting the new governess to her room, Mrs. Fairfax told her about Edward Rochester, the owner of the estate. He was a very influential and respected man in these parts. Jane was delighted with her cozy new room with a fireplace. After years spent in the orphanage, she had become unaccustomed to comfort and simple human warmth. The next morning, Jane was ready to begin her duties as a governess. Mrs. Fairfax introduced her to a little girl named Adele Varence, who spoke only in French. Jane, who was fluent in French, asked Adele about her parents. Adele said her mother had gone to heaven. The girl lived here because Mr. Rochester took pity on her. From then on, Jane began teaching Adele. They spent a lot of time together. One day Adele mentioned that the servants said a woman with black hair, white skin, and sapphire eyes roamed the house at night. Of course Jane didn't take this seriously. Mrs. Fairfax noticed that Jane often looked out the window and seemed melancholic. Jane confessed that she was pained by the fact that a woman couldn't control her life like a man. Jane dreams of seeing the world, but she is destined for a different fate. To distract Jane from her melancholic thoughts, Mrs. Fairfax tasked her with sending a letter. By the time Jane set out, it had already started to darken. The forest shrouded in mist seemed eerie. Jane didn't notice she was in the path of a horse. The rider fell and began cursing loudly, not understanding how this girl appeared here. Learning that the girl was a governess at Rochester's mansion, the man reluctantly accepted her help and limped to his horse. Later, when Jane returned to the mansion, agitated Mrs. Fairfax said that Mr. Rochester had suddenly returned. He had sprained his leg and was in a very bad mood. Realizing that Mr. Rochester was indeed the same rider, Jane hesitated for a long time before showing herself to him, but there was no choice. Mr. Rochester was pleased with Adele's progress, even though he claimed she wasn't particularly bright or talented. Thanks to Jane, she had managed to learn several subjects in just 3 months. Mr. Rochester also asked Jane to share her own sad story. A woman with a noble family name does not go into governessing for the good life. Jane was not used to complaining about life, so she said she didn't have a sad story. Mrs. Fairfax became nervous when Mr. Rochester started accusing Jane of bewitching his horse. Perhaps she was expecting tribesmen like elves, dwarves and other fairy tale creatures in the woods. However, Jane was unfazed. She had learned to endure any insults. Mr. Rochester was clearly intrigued. Seeing Jane's drawings, he couldn't help but admire her talent. However, Jane was not proud of it. The next morning, as Mrs. Fairfax, Jane and Adele were having breakfast, they heard Mr. Rochester swearing from outside. Jane realized that he was an impulsive and unpredictable man. During the day, Mr. Rochester worked in the garden alongside the laborers, while Jane entertained Adele with a game of tennis. In the evening, Adele received beautiful dresses as a gift from Mr. Rochester. Edward asked Jane to come closer and said that he lacked a worthy conversation partner in the house. He would appreciate her company. Noticing the governess's gaze, Edward asked if she thought he was handsome. Jane replied that she did not. Edward realized that unlike other governesses, Jane had a straightforward character. She always spoke her mind, no matter what titles and influence the other person had. Feeling the need to confide in someone, Edward mentioned that fate had played a cruel joke on him in his youth. Since happiness was elusive, he intended to seek pleasure. At night, Jane couldn't sleep. At some point, she heard a woman's laughter and went out of her room to see what was wrong. A fire broke out in Edward Rochester's chambers. Jane woke him up, and together they extinguished the flames. Then Edward told the governess to sit there, and he went off somewhere. As Mr. Rochester had instructed, Jane waited in the chambers for his return. Surprisingly, Edward had ordered her not to tell anyone what had happened. He clearly had something to hide in this house. When Jane was about to leave, Edward thanked her for saving his life. If not for her, something irreparable would have happened. Now he owed Jane his life. He wanted to kiss her, but Jane simply left. What had happened made her feel conflicted. During the day, everything went on as usual in the house. No one knows about the fire of the night. Mrs. Fairfax said that early the next morning, Mr. Rochester had left for a friend's estate, where Blanche Ingram, his great favorite, was visiting. Mrs. Fairfax found it strange that Edward hadn't proposed to her earlier. For some reason, these words upset Jane. Later, she focused on teaching Adele, but she couldn't stop thinking about Edward. To distract herself from sad thoughts, Jane went for a walk and then painted. Only this activity brought her happiness. She was interrupted by Mrs. Fairfax, who informed her that Mr. Rochester would be returning the next day. He had asked the servants to prepare all the rooms. Miss Ingram was also coming. All day long the servants prepared the house for the guests' arrival. Finally, the carriages arrived at Rochester's mansion, causing a commotion. The maids gossiped about whether Edward would propose to Blanche this time. Glancing out the window, Adele and Jane saw elegant ladies and gentlemen. Jane was surprised to hear that Edward wanted her at the dinner party too. The guests entertained themselves with small talk. Many ladies spoke disrespectfully of governesses, especially Blanche. She behaved very arrogantly, showcasing her terrible singing to the guests. Unable to bear it any longer, Jane decided to leave. Edward followed her, asking why she hadn't even approached him. Jane simply replied that she was tired. Mrs. Fairfax intervened, announcing the arrival of a guest. Edward didn't want to part with Jane, but Richard Mason, who had arrived from hot countries, was already waiting for him. During the night, there were screams in the house that frightened everyone. Edward reassured the ladies, explaining that one of the maids had a nightmare. Blanche pretended to be genuinely worried. After everyone had retired to their rooms, Edward told Jane to go with him. In one of the rooms lay Richard, who had suffered a severe injury. Edward instructed the governess to stay here while he went into town to fetch a doctor. Before leaving, Edward strictly prohibited Jane from talking to Richard. Despite her fear, Jane took care of injured Richard. Strange sounds resembling whispers and creaking could be heard throughout the house. Finally, Edward and the doctor arrived. By morning, Richard was taken to the hospital. This night had been quite strange, but Jane had not fled. Edward appreciated that. When Jane asked who had attacked Richard, Edward only replied that he was paying for a fatal mistake from the past. Edward no longer hoped for happiness, but the company of one young lady had given him meaning of life. Jane thought Edward was talking about Blanche and hastily left. She could only express her emotions in solitude. The guests stayed at Rochester Manor for a long time. One day Jane witnessed Edward and Blanche flirting with each other. Upon noticing the governess, Blanche called her an ugly creature. Jane asked Edward for a private conversation. She had received a letter informing that her cousin John Reed had suddenly passed away. It shocked Aunt Reed so much that she had a stroke. Now Mrs. Reed wished to see her niece. Jane didn't want to disregard her request at such a moment and asked Mr. Rochester for her salary. Edward agreed to let the governess go on the condition that she promised to return. Soon Jane arrived at the Reed estate. Aunt Reed felt her end was near and wanted to unburden her soul. It turned out that 3 years ago, Jane's childless uncle had made her his heiress. Mrs. Reed lies to him that Jane passed away of typhoid fever. The woman believed this girl was born as a punishment to her. With tears in her eyes, Jane forgave the aunt. Afterward, she promptly wrote a letter to her uncle, informing him that she was in good health. As promised, Jane returned to Rochester's mansion. Edward was genuinely happy to see her. Later, Mrs. Fairfax told Jane that Mr. Rochester was preparing for a trip to Europe. Rumors also had it that he planned to become engaged to Blanche Ingram. As Jane walked past Edward, she congratulated him on the engagement. He caught up to her, confessing his affectionate feelings. Jane felt the same way, but the difference in social standing prevents them from being together. Edward is a wealthy nobleman, and Jane is just an unattractive governess. Against all odds, Edward asked Jane to be his wife. Jane was shocked. What she heard seemed unreal, but Edward convinced her of the sincerity of his intentions. Of course Jane agreed to become his wife. It was raining, so the lovers hurried back to the mansion. They were so engrossed in each other that they did not notice Mrs. Fairfax. The next day, Mrs. Fairfax advised Jane to be cautious and not to trust Edward. Men of his standing weren't accustomed to marrying governesses. This conversation instilled doubt in Jane. She shared with her beloved that everything seemed so unreal. Edward reassured her, promising to always be by her side. The lovers often went for walks together, savoring each other's company. It seemed that Edward was not at all bothered by the fact that his fiancée was not wealthy. A beautiful wedding dress had been specially made for Jane. She couldn't believe her happiness and eagerly awaited the moment when she would cease to be Jane Eyre. The wedding day arrived. Jane put on her dress and left the mansion. Mrs. Fairfax told her not to be afraid of anything. Suddenly Edward roughly grabbed the bride's hand and hurriedly led her to the church where the wedding ceremony was to take place. However, at one point, the ritual was interrupted by a man who entered and declared that the marriage could not proceed because there was an insurmountable obstacle. According to the man, 15 years ago Edward Rochester had married Bertha Mason. Richard, Bertha's brother, came in and confirmed this. There was a scuffle. When Richard calmed down, he stated that Jane had known nothing about this. Edward was determined to introduce everyone to his wife. It turned out that all this time, Bertha had been living in one of the rooms of the house. She was mentally ill. This was Edward's burden. Upon seeing Jane in the wedding dress, Bertha became hysterical. Jane hurried away. In her room, she let the tears flow. The man she loved with all her heart had deceived her. In the evening, Edward attempted to explain himself to Jane. He was surprised that she neither cried nor yelled at him. At one point, Jane felt weak. Edward lit the fireplace to warm her. Edward had an excuse for what he had done. Knowing that a madhouse would have been a terrible fate for his wife, he saved her from that at least. As long as Bertha was alive, Edward was not free. Not even the law could free him from his wife. Edward begged Jane not to leave him because his feelings for her had not changed. But Jane couldn't allow herself to be with a married man. Honor comes first for her. That same night, Jane ran away. When Edward realized this, he screamed the beloved's name for a long time. But Jane couldn't turn back. Fate led her to the Reed family. John often visited Jane to check on how she was doing. Surprisingly, Jane does her job perfectly and is happy with everything. She thanked God for sending her such generous friends. John saw a kindred spirit in Jane and believed that she was meant for something greater than teaching in a rural school. Jane lived all alone in this house. In secret, she still hoped that the beloved would come for her. Every night Jane waited for him, but they were not destined to be together. One day John visited Jane in the middle of the night. He had read in the newspaper that Edward Rochester was searching for the runaway governess Jane Eyre. The drawing confirmed John's suspicions. He realized that Jane had introduced herself with a false last name. However, surprises didn't end there. John learned from a certain Mr. Briggs that Jane's uncle had passed away, bequeathing all his property to the niece. Now Jane was wealthy. She couldn't believe it. After recovering from the shock, Jane told John that she intended to share her fortune with him, Diana, and marry if they would accept her as a sister. Jane had no need for such vast riches. She was tired of loneliness and just wanted to be a part of a family. From now on, Jane had found her own family. They lived together in the same house. But soon John realized that he had feelings for her. 6 weeks later, John was planning to leave for India and proposed to Jane to accompany him as his wife. Jane said she couldn't. Throughout the night, Jane pondered this. The next day, she told John that she would go to India with him on the condition that she remained free. She loved John only as a brother, not as a husband. Her heart belonged to another. At some point, Jane felt that her beloved was in danger. John tried to stop her, saying she had lost her mind, but Jane still rushed to Edward. She was very anxious all the way. The mansion was half burned. Inside there was also complete devastation. Mrs. Fairfax said Bertha had set the fire. Mr. Rochester hadn't rested until he saved everyone. Then he went back for his wife, but it was too late. Mrs. Fairfax swore that she didn't know that Bertha was Edward's wife. Jane was only concerned about where her beloved was now. It turned out that Edward had survived but lost his sight. Sensing that the beloved was nearby, Edward initially thought it was a dream. For Jane it didn't matter that Edward had lost his home, his sight and practically everything else. She loved Edward, and now that he was free from his wife, she would be with him till the end. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel not to miss more exciting new products. Also, the authors will be pleased if you leave your opinion in the comments.